All right, so today what I want to do is I want to go over some ideas about composite photography, and I want to share with you some ways in which I think compositing can be made much easier with just a little bit of planning. And the first technique I want to share with you is this idea of using a gray backdrop for photographing our subject and then building composite out of that image. And so here's an image I made last year of Anna. It's on a simple thunder gray seamless paper 9-foot roll. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to brighten this image up just a little bit. So I'm going to go to New Adjustment Layer and Levels. And I'm just going to open up the midtones to get closer to that middle gray that we are used to seeing with a gray card, an 18% gray card. I'm just doing it by eye, nothing special there. And you can see that actually it's improved the image, including her skin tones a little bit. I could come in here and use black on the layer mask because all adjustment layers come with a layer mask. And I feel like I'm losing some of the saturation in the red, so I can just go ahead and block some of that effect and bring back the rich reds in this image. And it's probably a little bit high on her face too, so I can just bring back a little detail there. So I can choose whether or not to keep the shadowing that was formed on that backdrop because she was standing a little closer. We were working in a really small space, so we have a little bit of shadow. Or I can play with leaving it and giving a sense of a depth clue, because one of the challenges we have when photographing in a studio environment with a flat plane as our background is we don't have any depth clues. And so we need that spatial clue of three-dimensional from shadow. So I'm going to leave it there for right now. Now, I'm going to do this incredibly in the most easy way possible. Because I'm using a gray background, I can actually grab any background. And in fact, I just grabbed a texture just to show you an idea here. I'm going to grab a texture and I'm going to just paste that over the top. Now, this image file isn't the right size. I can either rotate it, which might be kind of interesting. And in fact, I might flip it over this way so that that shadowing kind of matches. Actually, no, I'm going to go back the other way. This is the challenge with live television, is that I am literally showing you my thought process as I think about this. So I'm going to move this over here. Bring it down a little bit. When I'm just adding textures to a background, I'm pretty loose with my transformations. As long as it looks good, it is good in my opinion. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the layer blend mode to overlay. And this is kind of the magic that we have going on here, is that by using the overlay on a gray background, it is just adjusting a calculation. And in fact, if you look at it in the texture, you can see the texture in the red dress. And all it's doing is adding an algorithm, a calculation of tone and color relative to the image beneath it. And because this background's fairly neutral, I actually can add a texture screen to skin without actually changing the skin color, because it's not changing the blend mode of overlay is not changing the color because I'm putting a neutral over the existing color. So that's kind of an interesting situation here. All I have to do now is create a layer mask and reveal all and start painting black and set my opacity to 100%. The other thing that I want you to write down is that if I want to create a clean photographic edge where I want to be sure to just do the skin area and not lose some of the background area. If I want a clean edge that's photographic, I need to change the hardness of my brush. But what's really interesting about this is that I want to set my brush to about 80% hardness. Okay, not 100%, because if I do 100%, it'll look like a cutout doll with scissors. What I want is to be able to just have those edges blend, and I can just come in here and clean that up very quickly. So 80% is about how sharp a typical photographic edge is in a photograph. There's no such thing as a sharp photograph, but there is such thing as too sharp a photograph where it looks like a paper cutout. Okay? And I want you to notice, because we're in the overlay mode, you notice how we didn't lose any of the detail in the hair. The little fine edges of hair are still showing up, which is one of the biggest challenges we have when doing composite imagery. I'm not going to do the skin retouching right now. That's a whole separate demo, and I'm not going to take the time to do that. This is just a raw photograph. And let's look at the before and after. There's before, there's after. Okay. Now, I'm not crazy about the shadow area, so let's go back and deal with that. So I'm going to do a non-destructive editing. So when I want to make sure I can always go back to the beginning, I always make a duplicate layer that I work on. So it's non-destructive. So now all I'm going to do is select my paintbrush and hold down the Option key. And the Option key turns that paintbrush into a color sampler, and I will just pick a color right here and go ahead and just paint out. And that's a little too bright relative to the area, so I'll pick a little bit closer there. And I'll soften the edge of this, the hardness. Oops. Okay, and what the heck, I'll come in here and clean up this area a little bit too. Looks terrible, right? Oh, in fact, you know what? I'm going to just go ahead and paint it out. Just brighten everything up. I'm not even going to worry about being too accurate about it, because I can always come back in here with a layer mask, reveal all. Notice when I want to keep everything on there, the layer mask is white, right? So if I paint black on this layer mask, I will just be going back to what was there before underneath. That's that non-destructive. So now let's take a look with that textured background, and that looks a little bit better. And then I can say, well, it's a little too bright now. I can actually lower the opacity and blend that together. Okay. So that's just adding a simple texture to a background. And that's one way I can add any background I want and have a very small studio space. All I need is a gray background, and I can change the color and the texture of any background of any studio portrait I want. Okay. So now I'm just going to turn this off and go back to this image here, relative image. And I'm going to tell you that I went and did research and found a stairway image. Now, what would have been nice if I'd taken my own stairway image, but I don't have that for today's demo. I didn't have time to go look for one. So here is a stairway image, and I'm going to copy this image and paste it into this image. Oops, wrong. Let's make sure I copy it. I'll also show you something. One of the things I like to do is layer, duplicate layer, and I can duplicate it into a different file. So if you ever want to just make sure you're moving an image without repositioning it, you can use duplicate layer and duplicate it into the new document. And so there it is, all centered in that document. And it's too small, right? I don't care. I'm just going to resize it. Notice that highlight at the very top edge of that chandelier. There's a little highlight. I'm actually going to crop that out right about there. Okay. Now, I'm going to do the same exact thing that I showed you earlier. I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. And with that, I can actually adjust the relative size of this background image to position it the way I want. I want just really the more carpeted stairway. Boom. Okay. So now I can come in here and add my layer mask. Reveal all. Come in and set my brush hardness. Remember, when we want to be able to work up against an edge in a photograph, we don't use 100%, use 80%. And I'm going to set my brush width here. Now, what's interesting is I kind of like the way the color of the background image changes the color of her hair a little bit blonder. That's kind of interesting. So I don't know. I'll think about that later on. In fact, in this case, I'm going to actually, for the hair, I'm going to go with a really soft brush because those little flyaway hairs. And then when I get down to the shoulders, I'll go back up. So let's do this. Go back up to 80%. And now, what I like to do is just use as big a brush as possible and just get areas that are easy to knock out really fast. And then I just save the detail work for a little bit later. I find painting on a layer mask very therapeutic. It's just kind of mindless meditation activity. So now I can zoom in here, get to a smaller brush. I can see where I have some overlay going on in here.
So do you think this is just easier than using the wand?
Yeah, I do.
Well, yeah.
I'm going to show you another technique in a minute that's quite easy as well. But this is actually the simplest technique. And for somebody who's never done a composite before, this is as simple as coloring in a coloring book. And that's what I want to make. I want to make this friendly and approachable in a technique that anybody can do if you can hold a crayon. Does that make sense? The other thing I'm going to tell you about composite imagery is that there's no such thing as a perfect image. When we do compositing, I am camouflaging. And in fact, I think about that because of my days of doing photography in the film era, where we were retouching prints. And even when you spot a black and white print, you are really just camouflaging the dust spot. You're not getting rid of the dust spot. And so I was just talking with Eric earlier today, because he does a lot of compositing, talking about comparing notes on techniques. And that's exactly what he was reminding me of. You know, it's never perfect, but it blends in such a way that the viewer is not distracted by the imperfection. Okay, and I went too far on this edge here, so I can come back in. And I can easily, oops, come back.
You're painting white on the background?
I paint white where I want the background to show and black where I don't want to show. Okay. All right, so now, let's look at before and after. There's before, there's after, okay? But I don't think this image is done. I think it's a little washed out. I think it needs a little contrast. And so I'm gonna make some adjustments. And this is this technique that I showed you earlier in the class, which is the dodge burn layer using soft light. So now I'm going to add a little dodge burn to this by going to my blend mode of soft light blending, fill with neutral middle gray, 50% gray. And I'm going to use a soft, really soft edge brush, 0% hardness. And I'm going to go ahead and set the opacity I like, somewhere between 25 and 33%, because that means it requires me to click 3 times to get 100% burn. But I'm just going to add a little ambiance to this image. And you notice how that's making the model stand out in the frame. And the nice thing about trying to burn in where the chandeliers are is I'll never get that to go dark because it's a specular highlight. And there's before, there's after. Do you think that looks a little better? Okay. And then I'm going to add this is one of the few times, I'm not sure if I've talked about it yet. The one adjustment layer I almost never use is brightness contrast, except for when it's appropriate. Brightness contrast, the reason we don't use it generally is because it adjusts everything uniformly, meaning it brightens every pixel the same percentage, not relative to whether it was light and dark to begin with. But I like to snap up a little more contrast everywhere in this image. And that right there actually looks, just helps. Something about compositing tends to flatten out the overall image, and to bring that pop back into the image would be a nice thing to do. And so in this case, I'm really looking at adding just a little bit of contrast back into this overall image. Okay. And then I see something, you notice my background, I got that spot right up on that border there. Don't like that at all. So here's something, watch what happens here. This is going to screw everything up. If I adjust that background image, I want you to notice right here, the layer mask has a little chain icon there that indicates that it's linked and it's locked. And so if I change this image, it's going to change the mask. See how the mask is moving with it, okay? So I'm not going to do that. I need to unlock that chain to keep the mask in the same position, and then I can adjust to recompose that background image, okay? And then I'm looking at, making sure I balance out my symmetry in the frame. You notice I'm zooming out to get an overall look here, because if I'm too close to it, I can't really see the composition. So I'm looking at that way. It works pretty well. The other thing that I see that is the skin tone, it's a warmer room color than what the skin tone is showing, and we're losing a little bit of that warm glow in there. So I'm actually going to do a new color balance adjustment. But before I do that, I'm going to do it on the layer. I'm going to move that adjustment layer to be just above the portrait of Anna, so that I'm not changing the color of my background at the same time. So I'm going to go to color balance. And what's nice about color balance is I can select the highlights, which is really what the skin tones are, all highlights in this image. And I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth into that, a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow. And let's just take a look at the before, after. See how that just warmed up her skin? There, it's a little bit blue. Do you see that? And then there I've warmed it up, which makes it fit with that background image a little more accurately, I'd say. Okay, does that make sense? Now I'm going to do one last thing, just because it's me and it's my image that I'm creating. I really tend to like taking a look at it with monochrome, and I'm like, oh, that looks so nice. monochrome composite. I love it.